Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and introducing my wonderful friend,
Shane Jenkins. Hello.
Lovely to have you on the show.
It's a wonder to be here. Thank you.
So Shane has come over from America, specifically Colorado.
And specifically for this podcast as well.
You've flown over for it.
Correct.
No.
I'm from, Denver, around Denver, Colorado. Went to school at Notre Dame in Indiana. And I'm here for 2 years.
Yeah, you're with the Newman Center for Faith and Reason.
That's correct.
So Shane is part of a team of American students or former students that are serving within Dublin to rejuvenate the idea of faith and reason in line with kind of Newman's plan. So he's part of the church that Newman founded, and they do amazing talks, and the church is a beautiful space, and they have a wonderful choir. So if any of our listeners are from Dublin or are passing through Dublin, I would really recommend checking out what's going on in University Newman Church at the time, because it's a really great opportunity. And I will say that you guys also have a podcast.
I do. Myself and my two housemates have one called Talk Read, where we talk mostly about just things that we are either doing in the center or perhaps the experience of living in community as volunteers, which many people are considering doing after college. So if you want sort of a peek into our day-to-day lives, you're welcome to listen to that podcast.
Yeah, it's called Chuck Reach, which is the Irish for House of Bridget, which is the name of the community. It's the Irish spelling, so if you don't know how to search for that,
I was about to get back to that.
I'll link it in the show notes.
There we are, yeah.
It's great because, like I said, it's been such a wonderful thing to discover that is happening in Dublin is, people having intellectual conversations about the faith and promoting that aspect of it, which I feel like is very much in tune with what I was hoping to do when I set up this podcast. So it's really great to have Shane on, and also because he has agreed to come on to talk about my favourite poet, T.S. Eliot.
Oh.
I've been hinting at a podcast on this topic for quite a while, mainly complaining that I can't find anyone to do it with.
Well, I'm glad that I'm your first choice in a sense. Yeah, I suppose your podcast has always been hinting at it, right? It's its namesake, is it not?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I mentioned this it was probably the episode on detective fiction, strangely enough, where I referenced how I came to the name Risking Enchantment, which was mainly just by reading T.S. Eliot poems until a couple of phrases jumped out at me, and then sitting with those phrases until I found the one that resonated with me the most. And the line that it comes from is East Coker, which is in the Four Quartets, which is really fitting because that's actually the set of poems that we're going to be focusing on. And the lines go, "But all the way in a dark wood, in a bramble, on the edge of a grimpen, where is no secure foothold, and menaced by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment." The actual context of those lines is maybe less than edifying. It's not necessarily saying that experience is a uniformly good thing. It's talking about the humility that needs to go along with knowledge, and this quest for knowledge is not just a good thing. But I still love that, and I love that the word grimpen there comes from the Hound of the Baskervilles. So with my name being Sherlock, Rachel Sherlock, I love that kind of Sherlock Holmes reference in there.
That's lovely, yeah. And I'm sure we'll talk more about how, even if the literal context from the poem isn't applicable, that there are so many parts of T.S. Eliot's writing that just stand out in people's memory, right?
Yeah.
And we'll get into that in a sec. But,
well, I was actually going to say, I was maybe going to give you an opportunity to say, how did you come to read Eliot and get familiar with his work?
Certainly. I suppose the first time I properly encountered Eliot was in college. It was in my course that I was studying there. They had two required poetry classes, and in the first one we read the Four Quartets, and in the second one we read the Wasteland.
Wow, you started with the Four Quartets?
Yes, exactly.
That's crazy.
A bit of a jump, I suppose. But
yeah.
The way my course was structured was that we were given sort of the highlights of many different authors from the Western canon, and so Four Quartets was the first one we got. I think we also encountered it to give us an example of, as I'm sure this is a reason you also enjoy T.S. Eliot, an example of profound spirituality exhibited in modern poetry. Because oftentimes I think people can assume that post a certain period in human history, things start to get more Enlightenment-esque, they get more secular. They sort of distance themselves from this experience, and as much it's harder to find those poets. They get more sparse, to find the ones that have that spiritual connection, but
and that kind of creative genius at the same time.
Precisely,
the two are going together, because I think you can find very powerful but very secular poets that can be very interesting to look at. But yeah, the combination of the two goes like a bit more scarce.
Right. Like we can think of Gerard Manley Hopkins, who preceded Eliot, but then even then, he's sort of like the last in a long line of religious poets, so to speak. But it's lovely to have T.S. Eliot carry the torch even further.
Yeah, in a big way. I kind of had an unusual experience with T.S. Eliot, which was that he was kind of one of the first poets that I ever really understood as a poet. Like I would have read, I think most children have those sort of bedtime compilations of poems and stuff like that. But I didn't. T.S. Eliot was the first time that I had a name associated with like being a poet, and it was because he's also my dad's favorite poet. And my dad would usually mark his arrival home after work with, you'd hear like the door slam, and then immediately you'd hear, I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. So,
love that.
Yeah, and he also loves the line, we always come back to it every year where we're coming into the end of October and into November. There's a line from Murder in the Cathedral, which is one of Eliot's plays, where it says, in golden October declined into sombre November, and the apples were gathered and stored, and the land became brown sharp points of death in a waste of water and mud. So there was always just phrases that I knew meant something to me, and I knew that Eliot was important to my dad, and so I had a kind of affinity for him even before I ever sat down and read a whole poem, let's say. And then when I got to secondary school, for our end of high school, secondary school, going into university stage, our exams, the Leaving Cert, for our English courses, we have to study poets. And there's usually, I think, about 12 poets on the course, and most, if you're got a really diligent teacher, she'll teach you 8 of them, and then 6 of them will come up on the paper. And T.S. Eliot was actually one of our poets, and that was kind of unusual. And of course, I was the only one in the class who was like fist pumping the air. And I was the only one who was really pumped for this. And he did actually end up coming up on the paper. And so I remember when I think he was the last question. So like you pick one of the 6 to answer from.
So it was almost as though they wanted no one to reach him.
This was it. So I like dashed off my modernism essay. I was so pleased because we studied a big range of, you usually study like a couple of his poems. We studied all of Prufrock. We studied one portion of the Wasteland. We did Preludes, and we did The Journey of the Magi. So there was like a couple of them in there, but let's say the Lovesong of J. Alfred Prufrock was the main one that we studied first, which I felt was good because it's kind of his sort of first quote-unquote genius poem that people recognize. But I remember doing the essay, being so excited. I was so happy, and I was like, this is perfect. And I did really well in those exams, which was great. But it was funny when they do these kind of reviews afterwards that come out in the paper where they actually break down like how many students got A's in the country or whatever, but they also break down how many people answered particular questions on the paper. Right.
They give the statistics of the whole exam.
Right. Yeah. And I remember looking at the poetry one, and I think I was one of 3%. It might have even been like 0.3%. Like I wonder, was I like the only person in Ireland who answered on Eliot?
It was at the bottom. I could definitely see how you would have reached it first.
Yeah. And I don't know. I feel like he's, and we're going to talk a little bit about that he's perceived as being quite intimidating. And I think in some ways by saying they're intimidating, you're intimidating people to kind of approach it where they otherwise might just kind of happen upon it.
You're priming their mind for a certain approach to it.
Yeah. And then like yourself, I went to university and I studied English, and we studied the Wasteland, and we pretty much did the Wasteland like line by line.
It's quite dense. Yes.
Yeah. And it was only kind of after I came out of university that I then delved into the 4 quartets.
I think what's interesting about your story, if I can interject, but also quite nice, is that I think what spoke to you first, the way you talk about it, was the form of Eliot, such that you were hearing lines that rung in your head, or there was something about just this phrase itself, the form captured more than the literal meaning could. Whereas for me, I think when I was introduced to Eliot, it was so late that I was being told why this poem's content was significant, why philosophically it mattered, But it wasn't until much later that I started to fall in love with the actual style or form of the language itself,
Yeah.
But it sounds like it was a bit of a reversal for you, where your dad was already saying things that were just catchy and meaningful.
And That's it. And I think we're going to speak a little bit about the context. Obviously, the whole modernist movement is actually quite complex, and we're definitely not going to get into a really granular detail on it. And the modernist movement and how Eliot, as a modernist poet, writes in a modernist way and writes in a very deeply intertextual way, where there's a lot of, we were saying, not only are there references and allusions to thousands of other works in it, but he literally quotes from other languages straight into his poems. So you'll be reading it and it'll be in English, and then suddenly he's quoting German, or he'll open a whole poem with like a chunk of Italian at the start.
But it's not just speaking to the language, it's usually from another work, so there's a whole slew of associations with that piece. It's Dante, or it's Tristan and Isolde or something.
Exactly. And I don't want to imply that actually Eliot is really easy to get to grips with, or that everyone's been lying to you type thing.
No, but I think you're right. We need to remind people that there's something about it that can be really accessible, and that you don't always have to understand those references at the first blush to get the emotion of the poem.
Yeah, and he has a quote where he says, "Great poetry communicates before it is understood." And I think that's really key. Like, I think you can read a T.S. Eliot poem and not understand, even feel like you're missing what he's talking about for huge swaths of it, and then he'll come in with lines that kind of, like we said, sort of lodge themselves in your brain.
They stick out in a way.
I read a really interesting article written by Seamus Heaney about his own experience of coming to Eliot, because obviously the content of Seamus Heaney's poetry is very different to Eliot. He writes about the experience of kind of usually Irish life, but he said that Eliot really taught him how to read poetry, and how having this challenge of getting to grips with Eliot really informed how he was able to read and then write. So he says, "All this persuades me that what is to be learned from Eliot is the double-edged nature of poetry reality. First encountered as a strange fact of culture, poetry is internalized over the years until it becomes, as they say, second nature. Poetry that was originally beyond you, generating the need to understand and overcome its strangeness, becomes in the end a familiar path within you, along which your imagination opens pleasurably backwards towards an origin and a seclusion. Your last state is therefore 1,000 times better than your first, for the experience of poetry is one that truly deepens and fortifies itself with reenactment."
That's a wonderful encapsulation, and I wanted to say something about that reenactment as well, but was worried that it might come across like just saying, "Oh, if you don't get it, keep reading it over and over until you do." But I think there is something to be said for, you may read it now and only get part of it, but that later in life you will understand it. You'll be prepared in a different way, or you'll have noticed these connections, and you can read it differently.
Yeah.
Is it C.S. Lewis who says if you find yourself reading a book and you're not getting it, it doesn't mean that it's a bad book per se, but that you might just not be ready for it. But also, not just that, but an author I was reading recently called Charles Péguy, who's a French, spiritual Catholic poet. He had a notion where this repetition, that reenactment he's describing, can feel as though you're just spinning your tires in the mud going over and over again. But what we see as mere repetition for him is laid out end to end, like head to toe, over across many miles. And so what seems as though it is only the recurring of one thing actually lays itself out at quite a distance. And so I can see that here too, where for me, like I said, I didn't really get the beauty of these poems. I only got a bit of the content until I went back to them and let them sort of sit with me by reading it again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's so important to understanding him. And I think we should maybe just say, like I said, I'm almost intimidated to say, we'll just talk a little bit about Eliot and his background, because not only is Eliot himself a very complex person, but the movement that he was involved with was very complex.
And multifaceted.
Yeah. Maybe you want to start with a little bit about Eliot's background. I know you were saying he's sort of known in some ways as an English poet, but an American citizen.
Right. That's hinting to the fact that T.S. Eliot, or Thomas Stearns Eliot, is that correct?
Yes.
Was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri, but he wasn't necessarily a local or long-time St. Louis resident. His family were descendants of early English colonialists in the New England area, and he came from a very prominent line of people, such as a Harvard University president, 3 United States presidents, settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, prominent clergymen. But anywho, his family had moved out to St. Louis early on in his life to establish a Unitarian mission, and it was only from there, after he had sufficient experience studying at Harvard with, I think, philosophy and English, is it? He then took a trip, so to speak, to Europe, where he was studying in Paris and visiting southern Germany and northern Italy and eventually London, that he had an experience of sort of the culture and network of authors and thinkers there that made him feel like he wanted to stay. And so he ended up forgoing his American citizenship and taking on British citizenship and converting to
Anglo-Catholicism.
Anglo-Catholicism. So
yeah, and we're gonna talk a lot about his conversion, because I think it's really, not only is it interesting, and I know this is obviously a Catholic podcast, but I feel like when I was at university, or even before that, whenever people were talking about him, they talked about him in this strictly modernist sense, and how he was this person who was very much looking forward and about breaking down the old structures and things like that. And, that is certainly true in some respects, and even just by his involvement with the group of modernists who maybe had different views to him, but were part of this kind of revising of how you understand culture. But first of all, I think it's important to note that he always had this element of sort of tradition within him, and this element of loving the ancients, and this is why he has all these illusions. I think it's so. I was
gonna say, if he's someone who's only looking forward, he sure has a lot of references
to the past,
to ancient literature.
Yeah, and then also the fact that he has this conversion. And Shane, you were just telling me that you were reading that his conversion was this sort of like calculated affair, or in some way, but
I think someone had narrowed it down. I stumbled across someone whose interpretation was, his conversion was twofold, one of which was to offer him a space for reflection so he could escape his busy life, and then the other one was to help him blend in with English society.
Yeah.
It's very narrow.
Whereas, and I think we'll come to it a little bit later, because I think this makes more sense in context when you've heard some of his poetry. But the quotes that I have are things like him saying, without Christianity, all life is disgusting to me. So it was certainly a deeply profound moment in his life, and I think one of the things that's most interesting about it is that it didn't come at a time when things were happy for him. Like you were saying, he comes to England, he enters into this like wildly ill-advised marriage that sort of torments his days for a couple of decades.
That's right. Yeah.
And then
it's never truly resolved. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then but towards the end of his life, after the passing of his first wife, he marries again and he finds this happiness. But his conversion comes before that. So it doesn't come from a place of like comfort or ease, but that he finds a degree of comfort and peace within it, even in the midst of a kind of turbulent life.
Right.
But with the modernists, he comes to England and he is one of the sort of founding and prominent members of this modernist movement of poetry and of fiction and of even art and all of these things. And he's certainly not insignificant, not only just as a writer. He's partaking in it, but he's also founding literary journals and supporting other artists and championing their works. So, we can't forget that he certainly would have identified himself with this group. And
he's deeply involved and friends with many of them, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so even when we're pointing out where he deviates from what you might expect from modernism, I do want to stress that that doesn't mean that we're saying he wasn't actually a modernist. But the modernist project, at least especially in his eyes, was about kind of trying to reinvent language to encounter the new landscape of the new era and the new civilization. And that, we don't have the simplicity of just rhyming things anymore. Just that, there's got to be a new way of expressing, but building on that. And I think it's in some ways he takes it more straightforwardly. There's another poet called Ezra Pound. I think you might have referenced him. He comes up a lot in Eliot's life. In fact, the Wasteland is dedicated to him. I think the dedication is for the better creator, Ezra Pound. But Ezra Pound was part of this Italian futurist, which was like, why don't we level everything and just start again? Like, let's destroy all the old buildings. And yet there's this conflict in Ezra Pound because he translates Homer and he translates Anglo-Saxon poetry. And so there's still this like tension where he wants to be modern, but he can't stop dipping into the past in a way. But this sense that poetry in particular and art more broadly was encountering the new landscape. And I think it's telling that he was not in World War I. He kind of only saw the effects of it from afar. And that seems to have been maybe a little bit more common within his group of modernist poets. And I wonder, is there something in there whereas someone like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis was right at the battlefront, where they kind of had to come back to these older forms and regain the sense of nobility to make sense of the world. Whereas I feel like in some ways T.S. Eliot's distance from that allowed him to engage with the brokenness and the fragmentation of society in a different way.
Yeah, I would certainly say that's true.
And so he builds up these poems, and in particular the Wasteland. I don't think I would recommend starting with maybe Prufrock. If you're going to start with that side of his poetry, I think the Wasteland, when I started reading it, felt very foreign to me. But he sort of builds up this sort of chattering chorus of history within it. But what we were saying is that he cuts it through with these almost like couplets and these really memorable lines, and his use of language it kind of like lodges itself in your brain in a way that I don't know if there's any other poet that surfaces to my mind all the time in the way that he does. We're going to take the theme of time within T.S. Eliot's poetry as a kind of base point. We're definitely going to look at a couple of other things, but as a sort of through thread between all of his work, to talk about how he changed in his viewpoint on life and his maturing through life. But there are actually two different sections, but they're kind of separated by a couple of lines. But I think the chunk of poetry that I come back to most frequently in my life, as someone who's in, like we said, the modern age when everyone's busy and fragmented and all over the place. But he has these words where he says, there will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 decisions and indecisions, for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. And like we said, a bit like the risky enchantment, that's not actually supposed to be comforting. Like it's not saying like, oh, don't worry, Rachel, you'll have time to get everything done. It's more like you will put off doing the things that you were supposed to do, and the things will make you great if you are called to those things. But it's funny because it's almost like an advertising jingle. Like it just stays in your head, Right.
But because of that, you're able to dwell on it and reflect on it and try to understand how these words might relate elsewhere, Hence that sort of the cyclical nature of thinking over it again and again, the repetition of it,
Which I think is a great opportunity to actually talk about Prufrock. It's the first, and again, like we were saying, it's so intertwined. Ezra Pound was the one who convinced T.S. Eliot to publish this poem. He was convinced that it was one of the greatest works of genius that he'd ever read. And
it's a divisive piece.
Yeah, it is. It's not the most universally loved, but like I said, the line "I grow old" is actually from Prufrock, so I definitely grew up with affinity for it. It's about a figure, Prufrock, who in some ways you could argue is kind of a stand-in for Eliot himself, and it's about his experience of life where he is constantly afraid of life itself and the passage of time and the call upon him to do something with his life. I know there's a quote where it's something like that: by not being saints, we are depriving God of being the saints that he wants us to be.
Interesting.
That he's so scared of both action and inaction. And so this whole poem is about this kind of circular notion. I think it's most likely centered on the fact that there is a woman that he wants to tell his feelings to and have those reciprocated, but he's so afraid of rejection that he sort of dithers on the stairwells. That there's a line about that do I dare and do I dare? Do I dare disturb the universe?
Right. And that all the while time is slipping in a way. Like he's growing thin, his hair is thinning as well.
Yeah.
Right? The things that won't always stay the way they are.
Yeah, there's this incredible moment where he says, should I, after teas and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head, grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker. I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. And I think that is so encapsulating of the poem as a whole, that it's this absolute agony at the smallness of his life, at his own indecision, at his own inability to be a great prophet. This is, these great moments of crisis within my own life are no great matter. And so there's the real sense of the loss of dignity and nobility and even sanctity of life, that it's all just the experience, which I think a lot of us have, of a very humdrum existence. And how do you express that through poetry?
Do you think that he's trying to say, or through the comparison from himself to John the Baptist with the head being brought in on a platter, do you think that is his comparison at this point? In saying I am no prophet, is that even though I have said things, in a way, they won't go anywhere. They're cut off. Like I am frustrated at every end. Is that his point here? Because I think, or should we not say that there is some sort of hope beneath this, or does that come later, would you say?
I think there's the hope of hope.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think he's really wrestling. It's almost like when you say the worst about yourself, hoping it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's almost like he's putting the worst case of himself forward.
Right.
But he's still tempted with this idea of making this motion towards reaching for a life that he wants. But like you said, that there's this real kind of sense of frustration. And in it, the time, like I said, that quote that comes back to me, there will be time. It's sort of like he's trying to reassure himself that, oh, don't worry, there will be time to do these things that you're too afraid to do. But there's also within that kind of sense that he is aware that he's just putting things off.
Oh, like one of my favorite lines, or one that stuck out to me, was that in a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. And so there's a sense in which, like, yeah, you might say there's always time to think harder about this and dwell on it, but then immediately after that, all that progress could be ruined by another minute's waiting. You know?
And it's just a constant back and forth, and with kind of lack of progression.
One comparison, if I can make it real quickly, is you mentioned that he was also a friend of Virginia Woolf. I think the comparison I wanted to make to the Lighthouse, there's an odd similarity to this concept where there are people who are struggling for language, struggling to get out of their inertia, struggling to get over the impulse of reaction to each other, where I can't remember exactly if it's a woman seeing her husband. I believe so, but when the woman is seeing her husband, there is within her a desire to reach out, to comfort, to connect. And then just at the smallest trigger of something that brings back her instincts to sort of like be rude and distant or whatever, all of that goes away immediately. And then there's this constant struggle for them to, like he's struggling here in Prufrock, to sort of speak candidly or to jump past that constant cycle of not really being able to say what you mean or being able to relate like you want to. So I see a similarity there in a sense, but this to me has perhaps a bit of a darker air where, because time is passing so quickly, there's a sense in which this may never happen. Whereas for them into the Lighthouse, there's some resolution towards the end of it. But
that's actually a great point, because I was going to come back to it. There's the element of time, but there's also this frustration with language. There's this sort of recurring refrain of, like, he's trying to approach this woman and he goes like, but what if she just doesn't understand me, or what if I have perceived this wrong and she doesn't agree? And so there's it kind of comes back in a bunch of different ways, but she says, if one settling a pillow by her head should say, that is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. And then there's another point in the poem where he breaks and he goes, it is impossible to say just what I mean. And I was saying to Shane, like, it almost feels like that could be Prufrock, but it almost could be Eliot when he's trying to write this, and he just gets to a point where the words have failed me in what I'm trying to describe, and it is impossible to say just what I mean. And there's this sense of fear and frustration around language. And it's interesting because Shane is part of my group of people who come over on Mondays for kind of Catholic fellowship.
Studious biblical scholars.
Yes. And I mentioned in the last podcast that we were watching Bishop Barron's series on the Word on Fire Institute on Hans Urs von Balthasar, and he references Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is an Austrian, but he moves to Cambridge, Wittgenstein, and he's a philosopher. I read a really interesting article where it was showing all the ways in which Eliot and Wittgenstein's lives were really like parallel, and there's no evidence that they did meet each other, but they have so many things in common it would seem almost impossible. Even down to the fact that they have the same birthday but 1 year apart.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
In his early years, Wittgenstein was convinced that if you could just create almost a new language, but like clear out all of the confusion of language and clarify it and distill it down to its most plain and clear form, then you wouldn't have any of these problems of miscommunication, and you could tell everyone everything that you wanted.
You'd solve the problems of discourse, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Bishop Barron says that Wittgenstein went on to sort of repudiate this later in his life and say that no, you must actually plow through the whole of language, that there are all these games that we play with the language, and games kind of is dismissive, but it's like that what poetry is about, that you're playing a particular game with poetry that you're not necessarily with prose, and that you know, language by its very nature has to be confusing or have double meanings, and that's where you get the beauty and also even the ability to communicate a very specific thing by like utilizing all of its nuances, but it also leads to this sense of confusion. And I was saying that I feel like both Wittgenstein and Eliot went on this similar journey where they were frustrated and anxious about this confusion around language, and then later with Wittgenstein he has his philosophies.
There is lecture notes, the blue books and brown books.
Yeah, and then Eliot goes on into the four quartets, and I feel like they had a very similar movement in those two things.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought Wittgenstein up, because again, in my equally limited knowledge of him, I noticed a comparison where, as you were saying, Wittgenstein struggles with the sense of properly and perfectly expressing thought and rationality in language. Because as you said, there's so many sort of like wild cards as a part of it whenever you try to formulate anything. But what Bishop Robert Barron suggests is Wittgenstein's solution to it, and you talked about this before with, I think, C.S. Lewis, is that there's a need to delve into it, as you were saying, or as Barron was saying, to plow through it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But I think by that what they have in common, Wittgenstein and Eliot, is that if it can't be perfectly expressed vocally, it might be somewhat expressed by experience, you know? And so in the line here from Prufrock as well, where Eliot says, it is impossible to say just what I mean. Immediately after, he has a line that follows, which reads, "But as if a magic lantern threw the nerves and patterns on a screen." And for me, I get this image of, if there was only some way of projecting the complexity of what is in the mind onto a screen that you could just read clearly and the pattern for all to see. Wittgenstein has a similar issue where he's saying, in his later lecture notes, that if you opened up the human head and were to look at the brain and to somehow show in an empirical way what is happening, you still wouldn't understand the actual thoughts. You could look at all the empirical data by staring at this mind, and yet you wouldn't see a consciousness. You know, you wouldn't see the meaning contained within. You would just see the pure matter of it. And so there is no way to like have this light or this lantern cast what's in the mind perfectly onto such a screen. But perhaps is that what this poetry is for then? Is to say, if I can't say it quite literally, maybe I can express it by delving into it, by like diving into the experience itself through description and illusion. That there's something better understood through that.
And I think that might actually tie into the reason why modernism moved towards this stream of consciousness poetic style, which is that the style of poetry resembles your own thought pattern, and in that way is more mimicking the experience of having those thoughts in a way that maybe just like a straight sonnet or something doesn't. I'm not dismissing, I love T.S. Eliot's poetry, but I'm not saying modernism is like the best and only type of poetry, but that there is something in there where the form is also trying to communicate and not just the words. And of course that's true of all poetry, but that there's this keen sense of self-reflection and the kind of the self as the center of the drama in modernism for the most part, that is particularly lends itself to this kind of stream of consciousness where lines kind of come in and out. And this is why you have, because I don't know about everyone, but certainly I have that sense of thinking the same things over and over again, and that's why you have these refrains that sort of keep coming back and are slightly different and yet don't seem to go anywhere because you're just thinking them over and over again. The next sort of epic moment in his poetry, which we were referencing, is the Wasteland. And I don't think we're going to spend too much time on the Wasteland simply because, well, we could. There's certainly plenty in it, and there are some points we're going to touch on. But for me, at least, the Wasteland, what it represents in terms of time is the fact that, and we were hinting at this with like the very intertextual layering effect that comes in the Wasteland, where he's just constantly referencing other poets and other stories and other speakers. And so it becomes like this chattering chorus, but it's sort of like a chattering chorus that comes from across all of time. Yeah.
It's just a mass of history all crumpled together.
And it's kind of dissonant and it's like a cacophony.
It's also fragmented, it's broken up.
Yeah, and it's a question of whether you can redeem time with these voices from the past or these voices from a more noble time, because again, a bit like Prufrock, he sort of brings in the noble moments of literary history and then undercuts them with a very banal or cruel or humdrum experience.
I think we were trying to make the case at the beginning that T.S. Eliot actually can be an approachable author, despite being part of this very esoteric or maybe on the outside pretentious group of moderns. I think that the Wasteland for me kind of embodies that in a way where if you're focusing solely on the references, on the allusions, on the language, and you see that as modernism, that sort of incredibly well-read but inaccessible form of writing, I think you're missing the shift that modernism gave at the time, which is to talk about the common experience of humanity at the time that was profoundly different from the 100 years before it. Things like dwelling in these unreal cities, like cities that are decaying but also historical, or a sense of placelessness when you're jumping around the world, the sense of the dirt and filth that accumulates, of the fragmented nature of culture as like I said, the world becomes more global. So I feel like these are things that we see today that we describe differently. For me in America, it's the fact that my family lives in Colorado, but they're from West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and before that, Europe. And so there's a weird sense in which I am supposedly those things from those places, but yet do I call Colorado my home, or people who are struggling with the suburban urban battle in the US might say, well, downtown is just so gross in a way that like it's hard to feel like a human there. It's hard to live and function normally, so people flee to the suburbs, but then there are places without identity. And so all I'm getting at is that, at least in The Wasteland and other works, I feel like Eliot is talking about those same issues that are beginning at this time in the world. And we may not notice them if we're just focusing on, like I said, the high references, but they are things that relate to us still.
Yeah.
And that's for me what I found accessible in this modernism. So
I think that's really astute, this sense of dislocation in terms of his interaction with the world around him. And he moves towards a very different perspective, which comes from his conversion, which happens around 1927. And he goes on to write a series of 4 poems, which become the 4 quartets. And they're called Burnt Norton, East Coker, the Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding. And those are all very rooted in places. Like each of those places are a very, very specific place. 3 of them are in England, 1 of them is in America. And he writes these poems which are so intensely about time and God and the experience of prayer, and they're incredibly beautiful, and each of them is quite long in and of itself, and then obviously they're kind of read as 4. I would recommend reading them. There's also a recording of Alec Guinness reading them aloud. I think even when I was refreshing myself for this podcast, I read them aloud to myself. I often find that a lot easier, and you catch the sounds and the rhythm that he's trying to get across a lot better when you either hear them or read them aloud. Sometimes
the play of language as well, you might notice like a double meaning that's hidden within a word. But
I really adore them, actually. I think they're incredible. And the other thing I was going to say, in terms of another great way to approach the poems, there's a great lecture on YouTube called A Reader's Guide to T.S. Eliot's The 4 Quartets, which is by Professor Thomas Howard, who wrote a book about T.S. Eliot through the lens of Christianity, and he's a Catholic, and he was delivering this speech to St. John's Seminary in Gordon University. But it's just a really nice introduction. I think you still need to, I don't know how it would feel to listen to it without ever having read any of it. I think it's directed at people who haven't read any of T.S. Eliot, but again, it's a very nice, accessible lecture that gives you the key into a lot of the things that he's talking about in the 4 quartets. But at the start, he actually says that he compares and considers the 4 quartets to be as of great artistic merit as the Cathedral of Chartres and Mozart's Requiem. And he's saying that with all sincerity. So
I don't think he's far off.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned the titles of each of the 4 poems, because you mentioned that as well, how they have geographic significance. And I mean, let me think. So Dry Salvages is related to a vacation home that his family would often go to during the summers in New England. And so there's a sense in which that, again, is tied to his past, or a place of joy for him. And then East Coker, to my understanding, is where his ancestral family is from in England.
It's where he's buried.
Yeah. Exactly. Again, returning in a sense to where he has come from.
Yeah.
He with quotes, I guess. But yeah, do you know anything about the other 2 as well? Do they relate to that sort of sense of identity and his own life?
I can't remember what exactly the connection with Burnt Norton is. I know it was a a country estate which the owner burned down himself. But the little Gidding was a community, and actually in the video I was just describing, he goes into this in a good bit of detail. It was a community that was attempted to set up of lay people, single and married, who would live the canonical hours of the liturgy. And so when there's a section in Little Gidding where he talks about if you were to come from any direction in any season, it would always be this way. That like sense of placement of this community living out the different hours of prayer and the different hours of activity. So I know that, but I thought maybe I should just read some of the sections from the four quartets, particularly about time, because that's sort of the ever-present theme between all four of them. And Burnt Norton, which is the first one, and was written before he had the idea to write four. So it was originally just a poem, and then it became part of four poems. But it begins with, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future is contained in time past. Which actually I think is a really Newman thing. Is it Newman who says that like all of the tree is encapsulated in the acorn? That
possibly
this sense that both your future and your past are contained within a single moment.
Right, but mysteriously though, because in a way only the present exists to us, and yet the other two seem to be entirely linked to it. You know?
Yeah. And he says that, and he kind of repudiates what he says about dithering and this sense of like possibility, but the lack of possibility that's in Prufrock, where the next lines he kind of goes on to say, if all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. So he is at this point kind of casting off this clinging to all of the possibilities of life. I think it's such an interesting thing to have as your sort of opening statement for this poem, and then ultimately for all four of the poems.
Yeah, it's another passage from this poem that I think relates to this, and how time is in some way at the center of what this poem is going to be about. It goes, at the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement. And do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, there is only the dance. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. And I think the reason I bring this up is that there's a few passages for me that stick out as though they're just an underpinning of these other musings he's having, an underpinning of the fact that, as you say, that if all time is in a way what we're obsessed with, where it is contained, where it exists, that if we can't access that future or the past anymore, and we're left with what we can access in the present, there's something about that space being the still point of all the rest that is moving and fluctuating. And he's going to get at as well someone who embodies that still point, in my opinion. But I think that's a lovely point to make, that where you mentioned in Prufrock, there's a despair in the sense that things are always moving and constantly changing. And at the beginning of Four Quartets, there's a reference to Heraclitus, right, who has the sense of everything always being in flux and change. That here he offers something that pierces through it, something that is at the center of the wheel, which I think is a lovely image. But
yeah, I was actually thinking it's funny because in that line about at the still point there is dance but neither arrest nor movement, and it's in East Coker. I don't know whether that's the same poem, but he goes on to have a line where he says, so the darkness shall be the light and the stillness the dancing. At some point all of the distraction, and he talks a lot about distraction in the poems, that like all of that fades away, and that actually the moment of stillness will be the moment of ultimate joy and expression.
Right, and that coexistence of paradox, which we're going to see another place in this poem, the introduction of paradox, it's I don't want to just jump to it immediately, but it's so profoundly, I think, a Christian element or a Christian philosophy, the marriage of two paradoxical truths in a way to get at something that's beyond them or deeper than them, right? The notion that there is both temporality and eternity coexistent in a way, or the sense of an irredeemable or unredeemable time and existence that is supposedly redeemed through embodying that paradox, right? Yeah,
and I think, and particularly since we mentioned him but didn't actually quote him we were talking about the course on Hunzers when Balthasar has that quote where he says, Christmas is not an event within history, but rather the invasion of time by eternity.
It is an eternal reality in a temporal context, right?
Yeah. And I think that is so at the heart of what the four quartets are about, because he really tries to express how, while being informed by tradition, which is something we'll come back to, and he doesn't cast off the world, but that the moment that we are looking for is the present moment, which is also the only moment that has any kind of divinity in it, because that is the moment that Jesus enters into, which is the present moment. And I think it's fitting, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about, when you say paradoxes, I think of Chesterton, and when we talk about this, I think of Lewis, and both of them started off as really at odds with Eliot, and as he moved on in his journey and they kind of came to know him a bit better, they sort of reconciled their notions. So I think it's very fitting that I might be quoting C.S. Lewis, but of course I must quote the Screwtape letters.
Please do.
As always, it's from the perspective of the devils, but they say, "The humans live in time, but our enemy destines them for eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself, and to that point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment, and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone freedom and actuality are offered them. He would therefore have them continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. Our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature and, to that extent, resembles eternity. It is far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to them, so that in making them think about it, we make them think of unrealities. In a word, the future is, of all things, the least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time. And I think that is so completely in line with what Eliot is talking about in these poems. I think it's in the Dry Salvages. I'll get the exact quote now, where he warns against, and I'm sure as Eliot would warn against, the tendency, especially as he says in times of turmoil, to look towards soothsaying and trying to tell the future. He goes on to do this like really long enumeration. So he goes, to communicate with Mars, converse with spirits, to report the behaviour of the sea monster, to describe the horoscope, haruspicate or scry, observe disease and signatures, evoke biography from the wrinkles of the palm and tragedy from fingers, release omens by sortilege or tea leaves, riddle the inevitable with playing cards, fiddle with pentagrams or barbiturate assets, or dissect the recurrent image of the preconscious terrors, to explore the womb or the tomb or dreams. These are all usual pastimes and drugs and features of the press. That's so funny to me. He just is so dismissive. Like, could there be anything lower? These are usual pastimes, drugs, and features of the press.
Right. I don't know what to call them, but they're the like the trashy magazine focuses of the time.
Yeah. And then he says, and will always be, some of them especially when there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road. Men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardour and selflessness and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, but you are the music while the music lasts. There are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. I mean, I know it was quite a long quote.
Oh, no, but I think there's so much to delve into there. One, he's so right to say that people, whether or not they're aware of the solution, all are aware of the obsession with the problem. People are so worried. Or sorry, as something that your man was talking about in the lecture, which I will steal, is that in a way humans uniquely are obsessed with that past and future. They uniquely stand out as conscious beings, so to speak, that they can be aware of these things and in a way plagued by them because they're constantly wondering what they mean for their lives. Both the future, as you were saying, or C.S. Lewis said, it's the most unreal. That one's the most tricky because you can be so caught up in what you want to happen or what might happen that you're really living in a non-existence. But with the past, it's more that you're obsessing over something which is true, did exist, but can't really be affected anymore. Which I guess that's kind of clear, but I think what I'm getting at is that he's right to say people recognize that this is a core part of maybe human frustration or human existence or human longing in some way. And yet for him, or the best answer to that, the best event that seems to cut through it and allow people to transcend that is the Christian truth, right? It is the one, the capital I incarnation, who goes from eternal to temporal, who invites us into a relationship in the present moment with eternity. And that's, for me at least, what I get. And I was looking on the side while you're reading that at the St. Augustine passage from the Confessions in which he talks about time. But he has two funny lines I'll read. One of which is when he's thinking about the question of time. He's saying, if I was supposed to define time, he says, if no one asks me, I know. As in, I know what it is. But if I wish to explain it to him who asks, I know not. I really...
That's so relatable.
Right. And then further down, he speaks about in the obsession with past and future, as he wishes to sort of understand where these two realms exist. He says, if there are times past and future, I desire to know where they are. But if as yet I do not succeed, I still know wherever they are, that they are not there as future or past, but as present. I'll paraphrase briefly. He says that past moments, though they did at one point exist, only exist in the present because they exist in the memory, like the recalling of the present. And future moments as well, though they don't exist at all, seem to exist in preconception, even though, again, they don't exist. So it all is just stunning how so many Christian thinkers that seem to all fit into this question of time. I think it's so pertinent because we have an eternal being that, in a way, is asking us to live in a temporal context. And that itself is already troubling or problematic or seems to be a categorical separation of us from our creator, right?
Yeah.
But that's why T.S. Eliot hones in on this issue or this problem, this question, is because he knows it affects all humans, but that it's something which, in theory or in his experience, can be reconciled or can be redeemed, in contrast to what he says at the beginning, unredeemable time,
Yeah, that's really it. And that I think that's what's so comforting and beautiful about the four quartets is this sense of redemption and peace that comes in it. I know there was one place, I think it might have even just been on the Wikipedia page, where they were saying how it's almost like a Dante moment. And actually Burnt Norton opens near the start with this, like, I have had 20 years. I think he's 40 at this stage, like it's sort of useless 20 years that I kind of wasted. And it's very reminiscent of like, I'm at the midpoint of my life that opens the Inferno. But they drew a correlation between those early poems like Prufrock and the Wasteland as being the Inferno, and then maybe they said Ash Wednesday. I would probably put the Journey of the Magi in there as the sort of Purgatorio ones, and then these last four poems are sort of his Paradiso, and he doesn't really write much poetry afterwards. And it's funny because he has this refrain of like, the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. But in some respects, this kind of is the end of his poetry. He kind of focuses more on theatre. He had this great desire to bring back verse theatre and had such a love for it, which to me makes it even more upsetting that the theatre he's most associated with now is Cats.
Wow, a legacy tarnished.
I mean, I know there's some people like Cats, and this is aside from the movie that just came out, which I'm not sure anyone liked, except in a sort of Schadenfreude kind of way. But I'm not really a particularly big fan of Cats, but also just that it's so frustrating to me that this is the thing that most people seem to know him for, which is that he wrote a poem once, which was a perfectly fine comic poem. Right.
But ends up being supposedly his entire pop legacy.
Yeah. It's so upsetting. But to contrast that, in the four quartets, he ends Little Gidding, which is the last poem, which this is, I find it really moving. I almost I'm a bit disappointed in myself that my voice often shakes when I recite these lines, and it's so like, get a grip.
There's something about it that is, I don't know what to say, but it does kind of bring you to tears in a way, because he's described this I don't want to say despair, but the sense of feeling lost or stuck or in a rut that you can't quite escape, but yet you're told to live in and keep walking down. And then for me, Little Gidding offers a sense in which all is made right, and that you can kind of understand that which was so problematic in a different way, you know? And so that's why it's so meaningful, or like,
and he has that Julian of Norwich quote that he comes back to over and over again, which is all shall be well.
Right.
But the last two stanzas of the poem are, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time, through the unknown, unremembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flames are enfolded into the knotted crown of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. And again, those images of fire and roses as Christian imageries are woven throughout the four poems. But there's almost to me like a sense of, and it's almost the reverse of Lord of the Rings, where they come back to the Shire and the Shire is ruined. But that part in all of those quest stories where you arrive back home and suddenly understand what it was that you started out from in the first place.
Right.
There's, I don't know, there's a real emotion to that when we die, when the end is our beginning, which is what he's saying, that we will have a greater knowledge of what the beginning was to begin with. Right.
And I mean, there's so many layers I can delve into this here. I'll read another passage that deals with the end and the beginning really quick, though, before I do. But just before the stanzas you read, there's one that goes, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. Every poem an epitaph, and any action is a step to the block, to the fire, down to the sea's throat, or to an illegible stone, and that is where we start. We die with the dying, see, they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration.
I love that like every step and every block. And that's what we were saying, that as we move towards the end, and even if we think of the word end, you can also think of the word purpose or teleos, that like sense of like what our deepest meaning is. The end of our expression of ourselves is as well.
Right. I was going to get at the sense in which the end looking like the beginning has to do with the fact that for us, there's a sense in which you're returning to where you came from, returning to unity with that creator, so to speak. There's like an arc of both humanity and an arc of your life, and it's also embodied in the arc of the acorn you were talking about, where there's an acorn whose end is to make more acorns, you know? And so it's funny that he has this phrasing, because there's a lesser known C.S. Lewis work called The Pilgrim's Regress.
Oh yes,
which is an inversion on The Pilgrim's Progress. But that aside, he has a similar journey where it's only by he sees a mountain from his doorstep. Should I spoil the story here?
And the end is where he starts from.
Pretty much, yeah. The end is that the mountain was behind his house and he was looking around the world. But that's pretty much the premise, is that you've gone through the path, but you see things differently, and that you can recognize that from where you began actually is like the place to return to.
That's why I think these four poems are so powerful, is because they have this Catholic and Christian understanding. And I will use the word Catholic. He was Anglo-Catholic, which meant that he remained within the sort of Anglican church, but with the, let's say, the bells and smells of Catholicism. He never kind of strayed towards Catholicism. I saw one point which was made about this particular choice of his, which was that he saw Catholicism as such a small sect within England that he didn't want to become sectarian, as it were. It wasn't about joining a tiny little club that nobody was in, but rather about
to stay in conversation with all those people he was like,
and that England should ultimately be redeemed by the full flowering of its expression.
Right.
But like I said, so his understanding of things was very Catholic, and I think it even refers to him going to confession. I'm afraid I should be more knowledgeable about exactly what the liturgies and rituals of Anglo-Catholicism are, but let's say at least to a very large degree they look a lot like Catholicism.
Sure.
But his conversion is so moving to me, and moving because, as we said earlier, like Shane is hearing that it was calculated, or that it was designed to make him more likable in some ways. And in some ways, I would argue, I don't know, maybe he was trying to move into a sort of more middle class.
Maybe it was a move up from Unitarianism. I don't know.
But he certainly lost or had his friendship with a lot of his friends shaken through this. Mm-hmm. And in particular, Virginia Woolf. And she has this really, I've never quite forgiven her for it, she has this really distressing quote which she wrote to someone, and she said, "I've had a most shameful and distressing interview with poor dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic, believes in God and immortality, and goes to church. I was really shocked. A corpse would seem to me more credible than he is. I mean, there's something obscene about a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God." It's really shocking to her.
I wonder, it is a rather sad and souring line, I'll admit. I wonder if something about that is as a fear or a feeling of him sort of abandoning or rising above the just the mundane human experience that others have. And not that he doesn't experience it too, but that he's in a way separating himself out from them, and that is what claiming to be a believer does. It does separate you from all else. But
definitely,
I think maybe there was a sense in which the whole thing about him being able to sit by the fire and saying he believes in God, to her they might seem contradictory, where he's both present in a situation and yet claiming to belong outside of it.
Yeah.
You know?
And he actually has two great quotes around this himself about his own experience of religion. And
Sure.
What I will also say is that, like, sometimes when you read about conversions, people have conversions and they stray again and come back. And, like, I think that's kind of the experience for most people. And I'm sure he had that emotionally within himself throughout his own life. But there's no question about how dedicated he was to it. He became a daily communicant. He was deeply involved in the church, and he was very much ardent about his belief. And so he has these two quotes from a letter to Paul Elmer More. And he says, he's talking about people who seem to have no need of religion. And he says, "They may be very good or very happy. They simply seem to miss nothing, to be unconscious of any void. The void I find in the middle of all human happiness and all human relations, and which there is only one thing left to fill. I am one whom this sense of void tends to drive towards asceticism or sensuality, and only Christianity helps to reconcile me to life, which is otherwise disgusting. But the people I have in mind, the good ones, are much more puzzling than the bad. I have an easy and innocent acceptance of life that I simply cannot understand. It is more bewildering than the problem of evil."
It's quite a claim.
And then he goes on to say, "To me, religion has brought at least the perception of something above morals, and therefore extremely terrifying. It has brought me not to happiness, but the sense of something above happiness, and therefore more terrifying than ordinary pain and misery, the very dark and the desert." And I think it's so interesting that Eliot seems to be on this constant journey into the desert. And it's funny because C.S. Lewis has a quote about him which is actually the exact reverse, that his modernism was him going into the desert. Because I think Eliot kind of became more amenable to Milton when he got older, but he certainly upset Lewis quite a lot by being a detractor of Milton, at least earlier. But Lewis has this quite insightful quote about him, and this was when I think they were definitely butting heads and not being particularly fond of each other. But Lewis is using this metaphor of Milton being like the Chinese wall, that within it is all civilization and outside is this kind of unknown. Right. So Lewis says, "All are outside the Chinese wall of Milton's verse because they are barbarians who cannot get in. But others have gone out beyond it of their own will in order to fast and pray in the wilderness." So in some ways, there's, even within Eliot, there's this constant sense of exile, of whether he's travelling interiorly into a sort of place beyond just good or bad in terms of your daily interactions, into a higher level, which is the kind of Christian expectation of virtue. Or it's in the way that he expresses his modernism, where he's going out into the fringes of civilization to create these poems.
That's stunning. I really love that quote. And it does give almost like a sanctifying sense to that going out.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because, like I said, clearly I love Lewis and Chesterton, and as I was explaining to Shane, that they were very much at odds with Eliot, particularly in the early days. And both of them wrote these quite scathing parodies of the opening of the Lovesong of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is quite famous. Let us go then, you and I, as the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. And Chesterton wrote this like parody version of it, which you can't see obviously when we're reading it out, but if you can imagine almost every second word being on another line at a different indentation, it looks almost like a lightning bolt the whole way down the page. But he says, now you mention it, of course the sky is like a large mouth shown to a dentist, and I never noticed a little thing like that. But I can't help wishing you got more fun out of it. You seem to have taken quite a dislike to things. They seem to make you jump and double up unexpectedly when you write, like other poets, on subjects not entirely novel, such as, for instance, the sea. It is mostly about seasickness. As you say, it is the new movement, the emetic ecstasy. And Lewis had a line where he said, for 20 years I have stared my level best to see if evening, any evening, would suggest a patient etherized upon a table. In vain, I simply wasn't able. And so I definitely feel like they felt like they were at odds with this figure who seemed to be deliberately trying to subvert the things that they held dear in terms of tradition.
Right.
But what I would argue is that, yes, Eliot converted later in life and he became maybe more in line with their worldview, but that even in his early days that he was more amenable to their view than they would have given him credit for. I know he says in response to Chesterton's evaluation of Eliot and the new generation of kind of younger poets, he says, we are not all so completely immersed in ignorance, prejudice and heresy as Mr. Chesterton assumes. He seems always to assume that what his reader previously believed is exactly the opposite of what Mr. Chesterton knows to be true. And I think it's really funny because in some ways Chesterton and Eliot have a lot in common. Like way before Eliot's conversion, he writes this essay which he becomes very famous for called Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he talks about what it means to be a writer, and particularly a writer within a canon of writers and within a literary history of writers. And he actually argues the point that poets are best when they are like other poets in the past. And he says,
and they just inherit what they've already sort of done well.
Yeah, he says, when we praise a poet upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else, we endeavour to find that which can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that it is not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And he goes on to talk about this like historical sense of tradition, and he says, the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence, and it composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and the timeless and of the temporal together is what makes a writer traditional, and it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of the place and time of his own contemporaneity. To me, that's Chesterton giving the votes to your dead ancestors, not dismissing their opinion by virtue of them being dead.
Yeah, precisely. I think I mentioned this earlier today, but what's kind of impressive in that is that whereas Chesterton and Lewis might have maybe reacted against the style immediately for maybe feeling like it was adventurous for the sake of being adventurous, not actually holding on to what was already valuable and working totally fine in prior styles. I think you're right in saying it's merely a difference in expression to start, but that in its roots, it still has so much shared or in common or thematically mutual between these former styles and former artists.
Yeah.
At least for me, I also see those sort of eternal themes present in Prufrock, where though maybe it is a bit dramatic and not straight to the point as C.S. Lewis or Chesterton might be, I don't mind that so much. And perhaps it's just a difference as to what people were looking for. That was sort of his critique of Chesterton at the time, was that he already assumes that what this person really meant was just the opposite of what he believes, right?
Yeah.
And rather than just or looking at it for what it is.
Yeah, and then I think it's beautiful to see how those relationships grew over time.
Right, exactly.
He became friends with Chesterton, and interestingly, he met Lewis because they were both involved with revising the Psalter, and they met at Lambeth, and he has this quote from an essay called Thoughts After Lambeth. And Eliot says, "The world is trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail, but we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time so that the faith may be preserved alive through the dark ages before us, to renew and rebuild civilization, and to save the world from suicide." I think that's a side of Eliot that you don't really see, that he does have a despair of the modern world, and he does engage with the modern world in the way that he writes. But what he's trying to say is that, in some ways, the modern project of removing faith and Christianity from society is what is sort of shattering the world at its core.
I think that was what we were talking about before, about how he can share so much with the other modern authors of his day in terms of understanding or sharing a view of what I called like the diagnosis of the times, of the problems that are new to this era of existence. But the difference, as you've described, is what he sees as the outlet from there on out. What is the end of even identifying these things? Is it merely to despair or to complain or to really do anything but find hope in the end? And I think you're right in saying that over time, as he grows older, he has a sense in which, though there may be a decay occurring at the moment, there's a sense in which we are called at the moment to try to preserve what we can through as he put the coming dark ages, which I'm not sure that you could say every other modernist offers you such an outlet beyond either focusing on the self or maybe like a certain nihilism in a way. I think actually maybe because we need to round up our wonderful conversation, but I think there's actually a quote which kind of sums all of this up, and it brings it right at the end to our theme of time, which is really fitting. And it's from a poem called Courses from the Rock. He says, "Why should men love the church? Why should they love her laws? She tells them of life and death, and of all that they would forget. She is tender where they would be hard, and hard where they would like to be soft. She tells them of evil and sin and unpleasant facts. They constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. But the man that is will shadow the man that pretends to be, and the Son of Man is crucified always." I mean, what an unexpected line from Eliot. I really love that sense that we're trying to dream up systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. I love that line, or the two lines. But the man that is will shadow the man that pretends to be, in which I feel like there's a recognition that we're aiming through these projects, through these systems, to be like gods in a way, where we're sort of past the problems that our mortal frames sort of carry with them, but that in doing so, you really are just pretending. Like you're in a way a puppet trying to stand on its own, or something a little less problematic as that. But I think for him, the journey that he's had is more understanding himself and his relationship to, as Catholics and Christians say, our Creator, right? Like the creature to the Creator. And that for me, that is that returning to the origins and seeing it in a completely new life. Yeah, but it's so hard to see that unless you can convey it. And that's why his poetry is needed, Yeah. You need a beautiful way to convey that truth.
So that's what we're saying. Everyone should read Eliot.
Please.
I hope that this discussion has inspired at least someone to check him out where they might have otherwise left him off as just another modernist.
Right, yeah.
But thank you so much for coming on, Shane. I've been dying to do this, do an episode on Eliot, so I'm just so grateful to have you on and have this discussion.
Of course.
I really loved it.
I hope it was sufficient. There's so many topics that I feel like it can get kind of just so cluttered, because there's so many things you could jump into, whether it's his poetry itself or his life or the people he was around, Maybe if I can advise our readers, like ignore the stuff about his or not ignore, but be careful about the stuff about his personal life on the side. You know what I mean? Because that can be distracting if you're just going at it for the shock and awe value that some of the articles I've seen.
Yeah, certainly. He had quite a complex personal life, but I saw one article which said nobody was was as hard on Eliot as Eliot himself at his best was on himself.
I think that's a good note.
And I think that's really key to understanding, and that's where you come back to this humility, and that he comes back to his own humility in all of this. But yeah, no, I really loved it. Thanks so much.
Of course, thank you.
And I have one last question to ask you.
Oh boy.
What are you enjoying at the moment?
Oh, I mentioned having read The Portal of the Mystery of Hope by Charles Lecky, which is not a particularly novel work among theological aesthetic groups, but if you haven't read it or haven't heard of it, I highly recommend it. It's oddly a similar style to Eliot, though it was written by a Frenchman around the time of World War I, just before World War I believe. I could be wrong, but it's around that time, maybe after. And he has this same style of repeating things and sort of speaking in a way that is fragmented but is underpinned by a common theme. I would say more, but I just recommend going and reading it and learning a little bit about its background. It's a great piece.
Great.
The Portal of the Mystery of Hope.
Wonderful. I will say the thing I'm enjoying at the moment, I haven't finished it yet, which is ridiculous because it's actually a middle grade book, but I just haven't had a huge amount of time for reading. But I'm reading a book called The Letter for the King by a Dutch author called Tonke Dracht. There's really beautiful, all of the editions they're published by a publisher called Pushkin Press, and they don't get too lost in their catalogue. They do really beautiful books, but there's, I love in particular, I got their hardback gift set and they're just really lovely. But it's a very kind of, in some ways, simple, straightforward. I'm going to say Arthurian. It's not actually Arthurian. I just mean that kind of era, that sort of chivalric era of a quest of a knight or he's not even a knight. He is about to become a knight, and he's not supposed to open the door of the chapel until the next morning when he will become a knight, when someone knocks on the door and gives him a letter that he has to hurry away with and embark on this quest to deliver this letter. And, in some ways that narrative is really straightforward and simple, and at least so far it hasn't really done the whole thing of subverting or kind of challenging your expectations. But what it does is do that narrative really nicely and clearly and in a very simple, fresh way. And there are even some references to God and Christ, and he disguises himself as a monk. But it's just a kind of a distilled version of those stories, which is quite nice to read.
It sounds really lovely.
Very relaxing. So that's Letter for the King by Tonke Dracht.
I want to spell that out.
That's Tonkedragt.
I would not have got that.
Again, it'll be in the show notes. By the way, I put show notes on this, and I do make sure to try and put as much information in there as possible.
Hopefully people read that.
So if you are looking for anything, please look there, because I don't want all of my work to be in vain.
I'm glad you said so.
Other than that, of course, we want to wish you guys, I think it will be the start of Lent by the time this comes out.
Ooh.
I hope everyone's Lenten resolutions are going well with all due humility.
Yeah.
And we're working our way now from Lent towards Easter. So it's always a very special liturgical time. Other than that, just want to thank everyone for listening. And of course, like I said, tweet at us, get in touch, share the podcast, all of those great things. And we'll be talking to you in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.